Thank you for coming. Thank you very much for joining us today and for taking the time to review Zero Impunity. I'll start with having a few minutes to ask you about your initial impressions of the movie and what would you like to carry out of it, or discussion about the universality of human rights. Professor Kapp.
Yeah, I found this, it's clearly a moving film in many ways because of the issues that it's dealing with. I think the topic of zero impunity is an important one, but also a controversial concept, primarily because a lot of ideas about zero impunity translate into criminal justice as a response to human rights violations, and that in itself is problematic because criminal law and order, law enforcement are usually tools in the hands of a state, the very state that used to be the target of human rights advocates. In the area of women's rights and sexual violence, I've seen that the zero impunity and the support for criminal justice has almost taken over most of the discussions on women's human rights, and that to me is a bit of a problem. What I thought was really interesting about the film is how it turns in the lens of impunity onto those who are supposed to be responsible for implementing human rights norms, in particular the United Nations, of course also the peacekeepers. And to me that was very novel to see that. That how do we, and I think it also makes us ask questions to ourselves as human rights advocates, as how do we, how are we made accountable for human rights violations that may take place in the course of our own advocacy, or neglect, or failure to act at the end of the day.
You mentioned the issue of turning human rights violations and the addressing of them into a criminal justice issue. What's wrong with that? Isn't it what we want, that people who violate human rights get punished for what they have done?
Oh, I think it's very important. Of course, I think that people need to be punished for what they've done. But the problem is that what the turn to what we call the anti-impunity turn has done is focus much more on the individual perpetrators rather than the structural causes for the violence in the first place, or even the context. So what we're coming up with now is a sort of one shoe fits all in our responses to sexual violence in conflict situations. Of course, the other thing that I regard with a great deal of suspicion is the fact that many states have jumped on board to enact criminal legislation in the area of criminal law to deal with issues of sexual violence in post-conflict situations. I worry that that's really strengthening the hands of the state and leading to empowering criminal law and the state, but not necessarily empowering the victim in the process.
Thank you, and I hope we'll have the chance to talk about the structural issues that should be addressed as well. Also, what did you think?
Ooh, I'm going to get into trouble. Hi, everybody. That film is, I think, an important film, and so we can start there. I think it does get a lot of the things that you were saying in terms of really expanding from beyond the individual into like systems that can really create environments where no one gets punished for wrongdoing. I do think from a storytelling perspective, and I don't know if you guys would agree with me, but I think there's some things about that do just put us right back in a paradigm that I think isn't necessarily so productive when we're talking about rights. And I'll just point out a couple, and then maybe I'm a bit too sensitive to this, but I think it does help frame some of the discussion we'll have a bit later about the broader concept of human rights. Now, I think if you start off with that film, you'll see that you think about who the filmmakers are, and so what gets the most billing. So you have a young Syrian woman who's the victim of sexual assault and rape, who has a chance to speak, sort of, but not really. You have this portrayal of men from the Middle East in a certain fashion. It's almost this other look at these savages. As you move along, you get to the Eastern Europeans, the Ukrainians and the Russians. Think about the portrayal of those sets of people. By the time we get to talking about rape in the Congo, when it's the French soldiers perpetrating some of the abuse of minors, notice two things. One, you don't hear any voices from any African women in that film. And then two, on top of it all, you have this, it's almost like this language of like, oh, well, they don't know better, but it's still a crime, as opposed to it's embedded in the actual sort of DNA of the person. And I think if you look at the film with that in mind, you have to think very hard about how we then frame discussions about who is really human and who has agency. Because those things, for me, as somebody who watches and who's really invested in narratives that are fair and different narratives, that seems to confirm an existing narrative, even in its desire or attempt to overturn or make us pay attention to to sort of a very, very real and important thing that we need to deal with, and that's sexual violence in the context of war. So I think, as a film, it's very interesting and it raises awareness, but I also think it fails very dramatically in that sense. And then it creates a discussion that I don't know gets to the core of some of the things that really keep us mired in these structures that allow for that kind of violence.
Thank you. This gets us to a point where you're talking about who determines who's human and who's included and who's part of the group that gets covered by the concept of protection of rights. Who is now a human and who's protected? Is everybody a person that gets the protection? And if not, is it a systematic thing that is embedded in it, or is it an accidental thing? Is it a mispractice of the law, or is it a problem with the law itself, you think? Please.
I think that the human there's always been a sort of a hierarchy of the human subject in human rights. And it draws on a history where certain subjects have been excluded from law or from rights because they're not regarded as fully human. Either they don't have the capacity to think, or they have not developed civilizationally. They're not civilizationally mature. And historically, that is evident in the colonial encounter and the export of what's called liberal imperialism to all different parts of the world, and the denial of rights and self-rule on the grounds, again, that either the other was too primitive or was not did not have the rational capacities, or was racially inferior or civilizationally inferior. So, and we've also seen in Europe itself, there's sort of a hierarchy of the subject, the very fact that women were property and did not have the right to vote and were excluded. Now, the importance of this history is that the antidote to it is not just inclusion, because actually you may include some subjects, but other subjects come along who are excluded. And in the contemporary period, we see that's true of, say, the migrant, the Muslim, the veiled woman, the sex worker as well. So human rights has always been based on a hierarchy of the subject, those who are less human, subhuman, non-human, and those who are superhuman, actually, who are entitled to rights. So in order to have rights, you first have to prove you're human. But there are many lives which are simply disposable lives and not even regarded as human in the first place. And I count the refugees and those crossing on boats as amongst the largest numbers today of disposable lives.
How do you feel about that?
I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, and I think that you see that, again, you see that just in day-to-day actions. I come from both Nigeria and the United States. I live in the United States, and this is a debate that's happening, let's say, on the U.S. side, when you're talking about Black Lives Matter. It's a debate that has been embedded into the fabric and the DNA of the country, and it's one that's surfacing now, but has always been there. This idea that, when, for example, in the Constitution of the United States, I mean, that whole thing that, like, blacks are counted as 3/5 of a person. right? And that was done so that people in the South could both not have them fully realized as humans, but also claim the presence of their bodies so that they could have more access to the rights that they wanted for themselves. So just think about that, and we haven't even dealt with, say, the conquest of the Native Americans. The same is true on the Nigeria side. One, we're dealing with the legacy of colonialism, and that has impacts up until today. But also now when you look at in the way that government or that society is structured, in Nigeria, take colonialism away if you can. It's a thought exercise. It can't really be done. But within our societies, it's very clear that there's a hierarchy of who is more human and who is less human. For example, I have done some work and made some documentaries in the Niger Delta, which for all of you guys is one of the most oil-rich regions in the world. It's where Shell, Chevron, all those companies extract. Now, for us to sit here and enjoy all of this stuff, we forget about it, but then there are people who essentially live every day without all the things that we would consider essential on top of it too, but they are disposable. If they get cancer because you're flaring gas, if they can't eat because there are oil spills, none of us really care, I think. And I think that's the thing that shows it in terms of who we really think of as human. And that's true. I'm just picking two examples from my own personal experience, but I think we can all sit down if we think really hard about places around the world where a lot of people are not fully realized humans and where we don't want them to be because that raises the cost of our existing as humans. And so I think it's not to say that anyone is necessarily, well, one, it's to say that we are all to blame, but it's not to say that you can pinpoint and say this person or that person, but it is to say that we have to recognize that we live in systems that were created specifically to dehumanize some so that others could enjoy. And in this room, a lot of us happen to be the lucky ones. Not everyone is so lucky.
Is the human rights regime part of what to blame or part of the solution? Because an argument is that, yes, the history of our shared humanity has seen us neglect, ignore, oppress, or exterminate others who we perceived as less human. And in a way, keeping us busy with the struggle to be realized as fully human prevents even an action of getting the consequences of that. You mentioned that the black struggle in the US 150 years, more than 150 years after the Civil War. There's still an absolute need for a Black Lives Matter. It has kept people busy in just realizing their equality or equal humanity for 150 years after they were supposedly liberated. The human rights body of international law, body of agreed literature, claims that all people are equally human. Is that not a beginning of a solution? And are we not just too hasty in wanting it to work instantaneously rather than giving it the due time to come to fruition?
So, I mean, I don't think you can ever be too hasty in wanting to be fully recognized as a person. I mean, tell that to somebody who has had their rights denied. I mean, I'll tell you a story just as a point. So and again, personal experience, my little brother was driving home from, I think he was dropping off his girlfriend one day, this was a few years ago, in Washington, D.C. Because my little brother is one of those people who's very careful about everything, you're not supposed to talk and drive at the same time on your mobile phone, right? So he pulls over to the side of the road, pulls out his mobile phone, and makes a call. I don't know who he was calling. And within seconds, his car is surrounded by police officers, 5 of them. Now, my little brother is a 6'2" tall black man, right? Big dude. He has one person yelling at him, like, show me your hands, another person yelling, put your hands on the wheel, and he's terrified at this point in time. And they're like cops all around, guns drawn, yelling. One of them reaches into the car and seizes his backpack, which they're not allowed to do, but they do, right? And pull it open. What they're looking for, he doesn't know. When they open my brother's backpack, and this is the thing, my brother is a total nerd. All they find are philosophy textbooks, Kant, Hume, whatever. He said this police officer looked entirely disappointed. So after that's all done, he turns to the police officer when they've calmed down and realized that he's not a threat. He asks, what was the issue here? And their response was, oh, well, you were wearing a hoodie, you looked very suspicious. So imagine that, and that's all because someone's rights, like his right to exist without being harassed as a black man in the United States, and this is a black man who went to Harvard, who's super educated, who's whatever, it doesn't exist. So tell that to him that he's being too hasty in wanting to claim, and that's almost a benign example, because I'm lucky, my brother is still here. It could have gone the other way, and there are plenty of examples where it has in the United States and all over the world. Now, I think that you can start with, no one is saying that human rights, and I think that's the basis. I'm always nervous about these discussions because you're going to get somebody who's going to say, oh, these people are arguing against human rights. Like, no one is doing that here. So don't go home, don't tweet or whatever that somebody said human rights are bad. I didn't say it. You're not saying it. What I think people are saying is that you have to look at the whole context. Like, where does the Declaration sit? Who is allowed and who actually enforces these rights, and how are these rights enforced in what situations, to understand why people sometimes find the enforcement problematic, or even just the situation, the use of rights as a tool very problematic. I think that's where we're starting from, and that's what I think of a lot, especially if you're doing humanitarian work, or if you say that you believe in universal rights, but you also then exist in structures that are very, very good at hiding the abuse, or using this sort of idea of rights to abuse others so that a certain set can enjoy full rights.
Yeah, I mean, I want to work with the story of your little brother, and just the very fact that you have to talk in terms of Black Lives Matter today is astonishing, right? That you have to remind people that these are lives and that they matter. And in the example that you gave, it was only, he had to prove his humanity, that he was a subject, he was familiar, he was someone who was recognizable, not unfamiliar, someone who was inscrutable. And that's true of populations around the world, whether it's the insider, the French Muslim citizen, including the woman who wears a veil in France, or the sex worker in India, or the migrant in Switzerland. They have to constantly prove their humanity, prove that they do belong, and they can only do that if they mimic or they look familiar. I think the problem with that is that it always produces a precarious situation. So even if, for example, rights may be conferred on the black man or the Muslim woman in France or the sex worker in India, she can actually lose her rights if the moral compass turns the other way in another direction, or if she suddenly becomes unfamiliar again. We've seen rights being withdrawn. Again, I want to use the veiled Muslim woman. In France, you said, well, isn't equality there for everybody, and we just have to work harder at it? Well, yes, you can be equal, provided you look familiar. But if you look unfamiliar, you look like someone who's threatening and dangerous to the human rights apparatus or the liberal democratic regime. Then you can be either incarcerated or eliminated, in fact. Look at Shamina Begum today in Britain, who's now a refugee and who was stripped of her British citizenship because she joined ISIS as a young girl. She became unfamiliar and threatening, in violation of all laws in any case, for sure. But if she's different, then there's a justification for excluding her because she doesn't belong.
This is a very interesting about the similar and different. Who gets included and who gets excluded, and it's a hazy thing, right? You could never tell who is at any given, well, with the exception of a very narrow slice, that is the poster image of any given population. In the United States, in most of Europe, at least my impression, this is a rich, well-off, white man, usually, who suffer the least exclusion possible. everybody else suffers a degree of exclusion, no matter what. And it doesn't seem to be a factor of how we behave. As you've said, your brother, it's a factor of how he looks and nothing else. And a pattern of behavior that was considered to be in mixture with how he looks, a dangerous thing. And the one sentence that sums it up is that the police one was disappointed. They weren't happy that the person didn't turn out to be criminal. This is the institutions disappointed at the inability to practice their power as they consider lawfully. Another example, I'm a very lucky person to live here and to have not suffered through the war in my country. I get stopped almost invariably in every single airport. I realize the beard doesn't help. I like it though. I get invariably stopped, and it's getting worse. The exclusion and the fear is getting worse. It used to be stopped until they sift through my passport. Now there are definitive times where stopped means that an armed person with an assault rifle gets a couple of steps closer to where I'm standing. This is only the past couple of years. And that's still a minor nuisance so far in my life until it gets worse, as compared to a young girl who is 19 who has been deprived of her nationality. She's stateless now, Sharima Begum, that you mentioned. And her baby, who's weeks old, died in the camp while she was begging to go back to her country of origin. She's different. How is that ever going to change? How am I ever going to look less of a scary Middle Eastern guy, or your brother less black? Or are we not just hitting our head against human nature and DNA? And isn't it safer for me to just do more Western stuff that makes me look less threatening, if that's possible? What's the solution here?
Sure. I mean, like that's one solution. It's one solution that I think is being advocated by a lot of people right now. I don't think it's the solution, but I think one solution is assimilation, right? Which is be like us, conform to this, and you will be safe, or you will be tagged and labeled as safe. There are a couple of things with that. Number one being that presupposes that there is a defined and immutable sort of cultural, whether it's Europeanness or Westernness or Americanness or whiteness, that these things are static and that you can acquire that, like as a commodity, put it and cloak yourself in it, and you'll be fine. And that I mean, we all know, and I hope that I'm not saying anything controversial by suggesting that that's not true, that all these things shift, like and I think you just said it, right? That like norms shift, like ideas of who we are as people shift, like dramatically. So I think rather than saying, oh, we need to come to a situation where you as a Syrian man need to now behave more Western, like that's not gonna do anything for you, because the question is, if outside people feel that there is a definitive break between what is European and what is Syrian, or Middle Eastern, or what is European and what is African, you will always have people who are trying to essentially eliminate you or exclude you from society as dangerous. I think what's more interesting, and this also then goes, to go back to rights, for me, it's all about how do you expand and bring, one, how do you recognize that cultural or identity is mutable, that these things shift constantly, right? That you can have multiple identities, and that a society itself, whether European or American or Nigerian or whatever, like that these things are all constructs, like complete and total constructs, and they can be changed if we are willing to change them. The United States did some work to change its understanding of racial identity and classifications. There's a lot more to go. The UK, and I mean the thing is, like, what I think the turmoil we see right now for a lot of these places is that work being done, and a lot of people being very afraid of what it means to actually do that work. So I would say keep your beard, and keep what you think is wonderful about your culture, but at the same time recognize that there are aspects of your culture, there are aspects of mine that we might want to change. There are aspects of Western culture that you do want to adopt, and there are aspects of Western culture that absolutely need to change and that can be positively influenced by a relationship with the outside. And I think that then brings you to a different understanding of who is and who isn't part, and therefore a different understanding of who is protected by rights.
I just come back to the idea of assimilation. Yeah, at one level it looks like, you know, just everybody try and just look like whoever the norm is. But if we go back to Shamina Begum, she was a thoroughly assimilated person. I mean, I think second generation. And she was a very bright schoolgirl, probably one of the top of her class. And materially, they were fine, well off, and then she goes off. So what happens here is, because she betrayed that which was supposed to be the perfect life for her, and she goes off, that already creates a great deal of consternation. But the idea of stripping her of her citizenship makes her thoroughly other. And what it doesn't then draw attention to what is in fact the fundamental question, is what is it in her society, in her liberal democratic upbringing, that produced this sense of whether it was disillusionment or anger or whatever it is, that made her make these kinds of choices as a young adolescent, of course. What is it? It then turns it turns the question towards that society, British society, to ask itself that question. How did you produce this individual? What is it in your society that produced this individual? And that then allows society to take more responsibility. The stripping of a citizenship means you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to think about it. She's at a distance, and it never comes back home to us. So assimilation isn't necessarily the answer, right? As I said, you can immediately be, treated as different in just a moment's notice. So I also think that the question of who belongs is very much a question that's now arising in many societies around the world today, whether it's in America or it's in Nigeria or it's in India as well. People who have been citizens since the inception of the nation are now beginning to feel that they're being questioned about their fealties and their loyalties to the nation, and have to constantly prove them despite their citizenship. So we have to ask ourselves, how have we produced this kind of where majoritarianism rules and minorities are no longer, to be protected, but to prove that they're deserving of respect and rights.
Isn't that the crudest form of democracy?
Beg your pardon?
Isn't that the crudest form of democracy that is almost universally lauded, and it is the judgment of the majority without any guarantee of the protections of minorities? Is this what we've been drummed about every day? This is what you want. You want to be democratic. You want people to vote. And if it's a 51%, then tough luck for the rest.
I think what you just described is, yes, that is, but I don't think that's not the society I would wager that anybody wants to build or truly live in. I think if you have a very crude understanding of what a functional democratic nation looks like, then sure. But I don't think I can't imagine that there are people who have imagination and who could at some point in time visualize themselves as part of a minority who would ever think that would work. And I think if you look at some of the founding documents for certain places, they protect against that in certain ways, because people recognize that you could just as easily find yourself on the outs. It's just, again, the struggle becomes who is on the out, and it becomes how do I make sure that I am never on the out. And I think, just as something that you were saying, I think a lot of this idea of in-grouping or out-grouping is going to get even more intense, because fundamentally it's about resource control and access to resources. And I think a lot of the issues that we are starting to have now come when people realize that we, really do not have access to an infinite amount of resources, and that we are going to have to parcel those out in a way. And so some of this idea of who is human and who isn't human is tied to how do I grab for the people most likely like me, and how do I make sure I keep them away, the others away from the things that I consider mine. So whether you're talking about migration and movement, which is totally a resource issue. If you're moving up from sub-Saharan Africa into Europe, you're voting with your feet, essentially. You're telling people that, like, there isn't enough for me to survive up here. And if you're in, say, Germany or Norway or Denmark, you're saying, well, look, we've got what we need, y'all don't come here. And therefore you then have to develop a system. You have to codify some of these things, who is and who isn't, which makes things like the stripping of citizenship an incredibly valuable tool. And once you are, because human rights in this current order are so tied to the existence of states, right, and the ability to have your rights fully realized is directly correlated to the amount of power that your particular state has, then that state, the citizenship in a particular place, is extremely valuable. I am under no illusions. If I just had a Nigerian passport, which I do, even my ability to move is supremely curtailed. Because I have an American passport as well, I can go to almost anywhere in the world. And if our ability to move around is a fundamental right, then just by citizenship or statehood, that right is not equal for everybody in this world. If your access to education is a thing, just by citizenship and accrual of resources, that right isn't equal. I mean, these are things that we have to think about when we start talking about the rights regimes that are in place.
And this is interesting, because then fundamentally, your ability to travel is linked to your passport. My ability is as well, which means that I can't travel that much because I still have a Syrian passport. Our ability to take a trip together is extremely hindered. There is a fundamental disagreement between exclusionary systems, the state being the primary one, and rights systems that accept people as similar. I am never going to be similar to a Swiss citizen without a Swiss passport, because what we have is a different set of hurdles that will never be equated. I could, quote the Universal Declaration all I want about leaving countries and joining countries, and it will not happen. We have two sets of accepted norms in the world. The very few challenge the existence of nation states and their exclusionary nature. Very few bat an eyelid when the European Union moves from a rescue operation in Mare Nostrum into a Frontex operation that actively prevents people from getting into Europe. Few people debate the visa system. There was a Yemeni mother who nearly failed to reach the United States to see her son die, who is an American citizen. And it was an intervention that allowed that to happen. We have sets of systems that are equally accepted, that contradict each other fundamentally. They disable each other. And of course, the strong one is the nation-state one, which very few challenge. To my utter disbelief, in the 21st century, we still accept that the nation-state, preferably, but not necessarily, within the appearance of a liberal democratic system, is the best thing we could ever achieve.
So if I can maybe challenge you a tiny bit on that one, because I think we do know how states behave. They behave badly most of the time and behave for their self-interest, as do the populations. I think I'm more interested in the conversation around how is human rights implicated in that? And how are we, as human rights advocates, implicated in that? I mean, the example I want to give you is that, for example, when after 2001 and the 9/11 attacks, we saw, I think, the reactive core of human rights actually emerge. The very fact that there could be an attack on Afghanistan, which was supported by many nations, but also by human rights advocates, including women's rights advocates. I'm not saying there was a consensus, but there were feminists and women's rights advocates who did support that, partly because they saw the Taliban as evil and wanted to free women from the veil. That immediately assumes that, number one, women want to be free from the veil generally. I'm not talking about in Afghanistan, it was a question of life or death. But number two, it was women's rights being used as a sort of gentle, soothing balm and justification for the intervention. And now, almost 18 years later, that issue has not gone away or been resolved, and we're living now with an even more devastated landscapes, strewn with some of the most lethal weaponry the world has ever known. So it's not improved that situation, but unfortunately, human rights advocates have now joined, and this is part of the anti-impunity term, by the way, with militarism to produce what's known as a humanitarian militarism, and gone in with military to try and justify human rights interventions and then to try and do human rights work. I feel that's really quite dangerous and problematic, and I think we need to take a look at that, how we've allowed the situation to become one where we are now aligned with states as opposed to being critical of states, which was, in fact, I think, what was the original purpose of human rights.
You are using two different arguments in this. One is the alignment with states, and one is the negative outcomes of the intervention. So my next question is, what if it had worked? What if the intervention in Afghanistan had resulted in a functional democracy, liberated people who are happy, and would it have been any different in your judgment?
That's kind of an impossible question to answer, because, I mean, it's assuming that's what the Afghanistan wants, to mimic what the West has. And I think there's a lot of conversation in the middle that needs to be had there. And the fact is that for over 30 years, whether it's the Russians or the Americans going in, it's only benefited perhaps those players, but certainly not the people of Afghanistan. We haven't seen them necessarily benefiting from that. But, I mean, you could even argue that, well, what if we just obliterated everybody, like Rajapaksa may have done in the northeast of Sri Lanka, and said, okay, there, we've solved the problem. The war has come to an end. Aren't we happy? I mean, but we know there are problems with those kinds of interventions, as there are with using military might alongside rights to justify your intervention.
I completely agree with you. One could go as far as when we are in a world that accepts violence as a legitimate means of communicating power or rights or anything else, then yes, the excess could go endlessly up to...
No, but we're in a world where we accept the use of violence by some states as legitimate and tolerable, but not by others or even individuals.
Well, it depends where you're looking. Those who are using violence always accept it as legitimate. So if we're looking from a Western point of view, yes. And this is just to take it back to the universality of human rights, where it breaks down. We heard on the film an argument by George W. Bush defiantly saying, you bet I will hold them and you bet I will ask them, and then lies about not torturing. And this is what the Americans want, he claims, and plenty of them. And this takes us to what Afghanistan wants. I don't think Afghanistan ever wants anything. Afghanistan is not a single entity to want something. People want different things in different circumstances. Most Americans who would have accepted that, anyone who accepts the violence being perpetrated by their side would find it appalling when it's perpetrated by the others under the exact same argument. how do we deal with this exceptionalism? I am right by default, and everybody is wrong by default. They might be right accidentally sometimes, usually when they agree with me. And I might be wrong occasionally, like the half-ass apology or admission by Barack Obama. But there is an embedded practice, I'm always right. What do you tell people when they are always right?
I mean, it creates a very difficult situation, but I mean, it's not, it's, if you go back and you look at, for example, the way the British Empire presents itself, if you look at, we can talk about Churchill in India and all of his statements. We can talk about Churchill and the continent of Africa. We can talk about Churchill and a lot of things. But when you think about it's again, I think this is where it comes back to narrative and what's woven into a people's understanding of themselves. So you get to a situation where George Bush can say X and a vast majority of Americans believe him, because if you think about it, and I'm a product of that educational system, from literally age 5, you are schooled in how America has always been right. From you just start from there, like even up through World War II. So and it's interesting, having now spoken to, say, a few Russians about World War II. The narrative you get in the United States, right, is that we were the ones who won this war, and therefore we're the ones who got to set like what is right and what's wrong in the world afterwards. If you ask somebody from Russia what they're taught on their side, they'll say, hey, we're the ones who won this war, and we have the casualties to prove it. And so I think you get into, you just get into almost a territory where every society, every set of people is going to develop a particular mythology about that society, and use that mythology to justify why they can do or act upon another set of people or a situation in the way that they want, and why that's then okay. I mean, this is why you can take a religious text, and this was, I guess, popular in Europe during the 14, 15, 16, 1700s, right? Someone can pick up the Bible and say, oh, let's go kill these French people. And then, like, the French people pick up the Bible and say, oh, no, let's go kill these Germans, right? And, like, God justifies it all. Do you see what I'm saying? Because it's all about that again, who is the in-group, who is the out-group, and how do we use mythology to justify or our understandings of those groups. I don't know, again, I mean, some of the questions you're asking are, like, they are the sort of the questions of forever, right? In the sense that, how do you define who is in, who is out, and how do we as a people focus on inclusivity and connection as opposed to delineating who belongs and who doesn't belong? And I think it's a very urgent thing that we have to think about, again, because the challenges that we face now are challenges that cannot be localized anymore. They never could, but I think we're becoming much more aware of the fact that, like, when you're talking about something like climate change, to bring up something that, like, clearly, given the weather outside, should be on everybody's mind, right? Like, that's doesn't stay put, right? And the people impacted by that will not stay put. And what's also true is that people who live in these societies here that are comfortable now will also have to move at some point in time, which means that I think we all need to start thinking about very, very clearly what it means to be from a particular place and whether that's even relevant, and who we let in and who we don't let in, because you might be comfortable now, but you could very well have to move, or your grandchildren or whatever could very well have to move in the next 50 years, and that's something I don't think that's injected into the discussions we have about who belongs to a place and therefore who, acquires associated rights with that place. But it's a very big and deep question. I think that's one that we probably need to talk about more and have places that we can talk about in a safe and non-contentious way, even though it will always be a contentious debate.
I was lucky just today because The Guardian published an article by Kinan Malik, who reminds us of an part of the argument around the creation of the regime of human rights, which was articulated by Hannah Arendt. And she ridiculed the system to a certain extent, saying it reduces people to mere humans. And in the distinction, and it's almost funny to say mere humans. This is what we want. We want to humanize people. We want all people to be equal in humanity. What she argues is that the humans as individuals, separate from every force, do not exist. People are factors of their societies, of who do they belong to, and their rights can only be useful as part of their context. I realize how dangerous the discourse about the different rights for different people is. The relativism of human rights is a slippery slope in the best of days. But I didn't think that's what she's saying. And I think the example used in the article is the reduction to mere humans is when people lose every other protection, the protection of the group, the protection of society. And he gives specifically the example of refugees. People who stop being citizens of somewhere and are yet to become part of anywhere else. Those are just humans. And the tragic thing we're seeing is that their death, there has always been in human history a difference in impact of people's lives towards others and towards the media and so on. The death of hundreds, thousands of refugees in the sea has become almost unnoticeable. Yeah. They were reduced to mere humans. What she goes to describe is who has the right to have rights. And apparently not all of us have the same right to have rights. This is a factor of the in-group, out-group of.
But I think what you're saying is, I think, to the point that you made much earlier, which is that like your rights are directly tied to the state to which you belong, and that's what happens. I mean, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was ratified by different states, right? That's where the power is situated, and you know, like we forget that document, like half of the people who now like hold this to be true were not part of states that existed at the time. You know, and so like I think that's where we get this basic problem. I'd love to hear what you have to say in that sense, because yeah, not like everyone has rights, but not everybody has the rights to the same rights. I think is a in the current system that we have is a big issue.
Well, since the inception of human rights, that's been the case. I mean, the male pronoun was in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There's certain forms of family that are recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and others that are simply not. So, right, and as you've just mentioned, the people who were around the table were people who were either still colonial powers or believed in the hierarchy of race, very much so. So they were the ones who were drafting this. 2/3 of the world was simply not involved in this because they hadn't, as we've already discussed, legitimately, it seems, acquired their humanity. They hadn't proven their humanity or their humanness. I think what Hannah Arendt was really getting at, in my view, was saying that you can't just treat humans outside of their context, their histories, their culture, their religion, their traditions, that our histories really do matter when we come to human rights. If a black man comes to human rights, there's a history there that denied full subjectivity to the black man, who was only an object, a black man and a woman, who was only an object to be bought or sold, right? So there's a whole history there that comes into play when you're making the claim that, which doesn't get covered when you're just making the claim that we're all humans. You have to acknowledge these different histories and structures that you've had to overcome in order to get to the place of just being recognized as human. And that's exactly what's happening with the refugees. The refugees had perhaps some recognition of humanness in their own context. What led to that mass exodus? It wasn't just brutal dictatorships. It was also military might from the outside that produced so much displacement, harm, and loss. And so there's a whole story there that needs to be told that is not being told. All we have left now as the vestiges of these lives are life vests. You know, nothing more. There are no other markers of the loss of those lives. We have no stories. So I think she's saying that just to say we're all humans simply doesn't cover the struggle and the histories of differently situated people who have worked towards claiming the right to be recognized as a human in the first place. And those have to be attended to. And we're suffering that exact same thing today. It's right before our very eyes, disposable lives.
There is a true risk here. There is absolutely a significant, and I think many steps have been taken. We do not accept the blanket description of all our being and desires and ambitions and so on as a clones of what template someone invented. And those someones are usually ones who have been in power at the time of it. We talk about our narratives. Me coming from where I come from is I have a different desire, different understanding of the world of anyone else. And that has to be addressed in the governance of our lives. I cannot be treated, and neither you or you could be treated as a run-of-the-mill just human. We need to include that narrative. The problem is, even as we speak, some of the supposedly very smart people are arguing that this just scatters the idea too much. And I had an accident. I browse shelves in bookstores, and I end up self-harming sometimes by buying a book that I shouldn't buy, and I knew I shouldn't buy before I got it. One of those is called Identity by Francis Fukuyama. You'd think that he should have stopped writing 30 years ago, but he didn't. He's saying, now women have narratives, people of color have as many narratives as there are shades of colors, and everybody wants their story, and it's a story that they cannot describe. Their narratives is specific to them. I can't see your narrative, you can't see mine, but we want them respected. He's oversimplifying to the extent that what he's saying is it doesn't matter. Ignore it. Let's build a single national identity by nation. Within a very book...
That's always worked so well.
Sorry?
I said because that's always worked so well.
Within a very small book, he's reasserting the functioning of nation-state in its current format, which hasn't worked, which has been an oppressive force, which has failed more times than one cares to mention, and eliminating any deviation from an imagined perfect scenario, perfect person, perfect group of people. If you're deviating, it's your fault that you're not more like whatever that is. And he wants us to just ignore that. Now, hopefully that wouldn't happen. People have gained power enough to know not to go back into, to be lured into that simplistic argument. But this is one. The problem I have is how do you expect me and how do we expect everybody to understand each other's plight that we will never go through? I was never stopped by a cop in the U.S. and I know, and from what we know, I agree with you. You're lucky that your brother is still here because that's a benign story as opposed to what could have happened. I will never understand how a woman gets treated in a patriarchal society. How do we go about reducing that difference in application of rights and in laws and understanding without ridiculing the narratives of people, without oversimplifying them and pretending that we understand them?
I mean, I think that, a good example of how we do it is why everybody is in this room watching the films that we're watching, right? And I think it is about, it's not just about, it's about story and the substance of story, which is why, for example, I can come down very hard on something like this that doesn't seem to be innovative in the way that it tells or is reaching for different perspectives. But it's also about who has the ability to tell a story. And I think when people complain about identity or like a multiplicity of identities that's now apparent to a lot of people, they're not complaining about, what they're really complaining about is actually this feeling that like hearing stories makes them uncomfortable. That's really what I hear. It's that, this perspective, I didn't have to think about this perspective. Imagine if you grow up in a small town that's isolated from everybody, every story that you come in touch with, you understand. As soon as somebody gives you another story, that necessarily shifts your worldview, and that will make you uncomfortable. And what's true of the world we live in is there are a lot of people, or there's a certain subset of people who've been like very okay and who've been allowed to be uncomfortable, while the rest allowed to be comfortable, while the rest of us have been forced to live with a certain amount of discomfort about who we are and how we identify. And what is happening now through the ability of people to tell their stories to a broader range of people is that it's exposure, and I think that that's actually a really good thing. I think being forced to question whether or not these systems of rights actually work and how they're used and in what service, who is using them, I think is really important for strengthening these rights that exist. And again, this goes back to the statement I made. No one is saying throw out the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That would be idiocy, because there is a lot of good stuff. It's in the same way that people won't say throw out your religious texts, throw out the Bible, throw out the Quran, or whatever. But remember that those things can be used by people with very limited perspectives, or in the service of something that is not necessarily altruistic or beneficial for people. The more stories you have about how that happens, the better off I think we are, and the more strength that any of these things gather in the service of labeling or realizing everyone's full humanity.
I guess I take another route to that, maybe, and this saying that one way of doing this is, of course, for the human rights advocate, and include myself, because that's how I might identify, is that human rights advocate becoming a little more humble, less of the savior mentality, that I've got this bag of rights, and I can go around the world, and I can save people, right? And we save them as if they've been sitting in a waiting room, waiting for rescue. People who have not experienced rights don't not live their lives. And so I think there's a lot more humility required here in our engagements with others, of listening and not thinking we already know what's good for them. And listening and learning something that we didn't already know before we began this endeavor. Right? And that, to me, is absolutely crucial, because there's just too much of a top-down approach to human rights, not just by states. I'm talking about us as advocates. I think this is a point of time for self-reflection, for inquiry into why are, after 30 years, for example, of women's rights advocacy, has it not led to equality, or empowerment for all women all over the world, right? Maybe I had a wrong idea about human rights as a progressive, benevolent project. In fact, if anything, it's viewed with great suspicion, because it's universal, it claims to be universal, and universal projects are often perceived by those who are at the recipient end of these as hiding something, as in fact having other agendas. So it's better to see human rights as an arena of power in which many people engage, states engage with it, human rights advocates engage with it, but people, who are not necessarily so benevolent also engage with it. It's an arena of power. And anyone who actually is able to colonize that arena looks really good, because we think human rights, in fact, make us shine. So I think there's, as I said, a lot more humility that we need, as well as a lot more thoughtfulness and mindfulness before we launch into running to the other side of the world to save somebody, to think about what is it actually that we're doing? What do we think we're really doing here? And is it about me, or is it really about them?
I thank you, and I ask your permission to move to questions from our audience, because I'd like to hear what enough time what people have to say. I will try to take a couple of questions at least, and then see if we can go. Please. Is there just a mic? I think there will be a mic coming your way. Thank you.
So I will concentrate on the title, which is Universal Human Rights, and they are immediately connected with international justice and international laws. So when we talk about universal human rights, that means that some international justice should be achieved, and this would be by means of international laws. So those are three different things: the rights, the laws, and justice. So seeing the face of the world at the moment, and that international justice is actually international injustice, and that human rights, those universal human rights, we cannot really talk about them realistically because international justice does not really work. And this we can see because normally international law should be standard and general and applied for everyone, to everyone. So that means if international laws do not really work, that means that we cannot achieve this international justice, which would suppose that the international human rights are fulfilled. So can we really conclude that it is just a dream to talk about universal human rights?
I mean, I personally don't think that you conclude it's just a dream. I think you can say that the system is incredibly imperfect. And I think what I don't want to do is get away from, I don't think you want to get into the space where you just say, let's abandon it all and live in essentially a place where anything goes. I do think you want to say that, look, we have agreed in some sense, and the process for agreeing was radically imperfect, et cetera, but we have come up with something that we can hold ourselves to, and then it becomes about application. And I think you then also have to work in some of the questions that came up here, which is the only way you apply through like the lens of statehood, or are there other ways that we can apply, that we can get to justice for people who maybe are not supported by states? I think that's going to be the real issue, and I think that's going to be something, again, that's going to be forced on us as systems change. Now, I think everybody probably can feel that we're living in a time of change, and I think one of the things that ends up changing is also the power of, or the importance of, states as arbiters of justice. And so I think, again, don't give it up and don't just throw it out, but recognize that it is imperfect and needs to be modified as the times will demand.
Yeah, this is very ideal. Thank you.
I mean, what else do we have?
I'm not really very convinced seeing the face of the world at the moment.
I mean, I don't think you have to be convinced, and I think I'm up here, so I'm supposed to be idealistic, but I don't think that you have to be convinced to still make it something that we want to work towards.
If I can just respond as well, and that is that I think the question isn't that human rights don't really work. The question is, what is the work that human rights are doing, right? So even if they're not doing what you think they should be doing, they are doing something. As I said, they may be justifying a military intervention. When we have anti-trafficking interventions, we see that anti-trafficking interventions have not stopped trafficking. In fact, we've seen a surge of the rise of clandestine migrant mobility regimes as a result of these so-called human rights interventions. So, if they haven't stopped trafficking, then what work are anti-trafficking interventions actually doing? You see, that's the question. Human rights is alive, it's very active, it's being used by all sorts of players, just like gender is, by states and all sorts of other actors. So then you have to ask the question, well, not that, women's rights not working, but what work are women's rights actually doing in the hands of these players or those players? What is actually being done or achieved? It might not look like what you want it to look like, but we have to know what's happening with that, what that tool is actually being used for. That's part of educating ourselves on not just assuming that human rights just do good in the world and that they're virtuous projects that move in the direction of the virtuous, because they don't.
Let me venture an idea. You mentioned three layers: human rights, international justice, and the application of international justice. In my view, the machine works occasionally and breaks down often. But the reason for having the machine doesn't go away. The reasoning, the assertion that there are fundamental issues that have to be accepted universally is in itself a merited idea that we cannot give up. I have to adhere to a an optimistic view that those radically imperfect in formulation ideas and the way they were applied are a step towards a better version of them. Underlying these, there is a conviction that is things should be better, people deserve better, and people are equal and capable of appreciating and practicing their equality. Now, I appreciate your pessimistic view. I think some of us have to be utterly pessimistic, but it's not. It doesn't eliminate the need for an ideal, the fact that things aren't going well. And the other argument is that I don't think things are fundamentally going from good to bad. If you look, there is a very interesting book by Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And he actually quantifies how much violence has reduced. Now, the fact that we see much of it on TV today doesn't mean that it's increasing globally. Murder, war, and suicide are reducing. Doesn't justify what happens in any of the conflicts we have seen. We should have everything we can until violence doesn't become the language of humanity. But we need an ideal to do that. And unless we have an ideal that puts people at the same level and accepts that we share a degree of humanity and a similarity before a rights regime, there's nothing to repair then. And I fear that by overly criticizing the current practice of human rights, we fall into the trap of allowing its adversaries to say, look, those human rights committed people don't believe it works. Why should we keep it? Why should we respect any of it? And that's the risk we run by being self-critical, and that we should at least be conscious of.
What I want you to tell is that the human rights, they remain ideal, of course. I think you understand me wrongly. But the way to achieve them is really very difficult, and you say that violence is decreasing. Maybe we see more than before, but what we see is just terrible. I have a feeling that human suffering is really at the peak internationally, and maybe the fact that telling that international laws work and international justice works is just kind of, hiding very bad treatments everywhere and exactly making the opposite. That means that people think that things works, but they do not work. You see what I mean?
So
it was not to stop to be active or something.
I think you make some good points, but I think maybe we can discuss that offline. I think let's take another question.
Yes, thank you. I don't know how you guys do this. My palms are sweating just with one simple question. But I think it's very interesting, the whole question, are human rights universal? And I think that there was a very interesting point during the film where we had some cases that were brought up to the ICC and were not upheld because the United States is not necessarily, those crimes are not held against them in the ICC. So there are also other cases as well where there was rape and torture that was ongoing towards men in Libya. So, I mean, it's been happening everywhere around the world and for years now, and a lot of these crimes were started with the United States government and then kind of brought up to other governments. So what I was interested in knowing is how can we bring the United States to the ICC and to be held in court for the crimes that they have committed in an international level? Because I think that is one of the most things that baffles me, is that they've committed so much and then they kind of are getting away with most of it.
I think the professor of international law can take a...
No, I mean, I think you're assuming that the ICC is a sort of, is a solution. Actually, the ICC is really plagued with so many problems. India's not ratified the ICC or signed on to the ICC, partly because, and now a number of African countries have also spoken about maybe pulling out of it, because it looks like it's always used against third world people. It's not used to bring people from America in front of the court, or from Canada, or from France, or from Britain. It's not. And so there is a sense that these institutions are always used, that whole civilizational discourse continues to exist and flourish, that it's meant for people out there. The language of the United Nations is the field. They refer to non-Europe, non-North America as the field. It's an extraordinary word to be using. So these institutions are meant for others. Not for us, not for the civilized part of the world. So it's a real problem. I think the question isn't, let's haul America in front of the ICC. That wouldn't solve, quite honestly, anything. And we have to think about whether that is the way we would really want to spend our energies doing that. The question should be partly, for example, why is it that human rights is now being taken up within the discourse of security and criminal law? Why? You know, even in the Security Council, resolutions have been passed on gender, peace, and security, as if that's the balm for women's rights when it comes to conflict and post-conflict situations. It isn't. It's about security. It doesn't emanate from human rights. So I think we have to ask a bigger question here, a more important question. Human rights is being pulled in a direction that isn't necessarily one that I see, where I see it having a future, where it's going to be more empowering. If anything, it is already subordinate to the security discourse and security framework. Already, you know, the refugee problem is dealt with as a security threat. It's not about human rights. It's about our rights over here. That our rights are being threatened by them over there. In fact, the whole universality discourse is being exposed today because you can see now the language of us and them being openly plied, openly stated. You know, they are the ones who are going to disrupt our social cohesion, and they are the ones who rape. The Cologne, a couple of years ago, the Cologne assaults in Germany. The evidence simply wasn't there, but it was so easy to make those connections that the allowing refugees into the country has led to see what we said was going to be the problem: rape. These guys are criminals. And led to the passing enactment of a law that feminists, I think, have been trying for ages to enact in Germany on broadening the definition of sexual assault, but included an additional provision, which was, I won't go into it, but directly targeting, of course, the other, the migrant or the refugee. So this isn't, it's not that we should just take the available institutions and think that they've actually solved the problem. If anything, I think the introduction of the International Criminal Court has complicated the problem. It's shown the racial division so clearly. It's a real problem. And as I say, it's moving again, the discourse of human rights in the direction of criminal justice, law enforcement, and security. That's very dangerous.
Sorry, as I've interrupted you. You were about to say something.
No, you said it all.
I fully appreciate what you're saying, Ratna. I still think, to simplify the question, how do people get held to account? If accountability is desirable, if there is any merit to people being, I don't want to use the word punished, but being held to account for violations of human rights. And if we accept the argument that the United States is one of the great violators by the virtue of being one of the great powers, and if the existing criminal system doesn't work, how do we go about accountability?
Yeah, I mean, again, my starting point would be different. I know that states behave badly. I know America has behaved badly, appallingly badly. America, Britain, Germany, just by the very fact they're providing all this weaponry to Saudi Arabia should just really, shock our conscience. It just simply should. We're I think sometimes putting the spotlight at the wrong place. And we need to change the direction of that spotlight. And it also means putting the spotlight on us. I keep coming back to us because I think unless we clean up our own house and our own behavior, we can't expect accountability from anyone else. How are we accountable for some of our interventions leading to what have sometimes been cast as just collateral damage, harm, injury, to the very constituencies that we thought we were going to help? To me, that's so hugely important. There's nothing wrong with taking time out and having a period of reflection. Because if our strategies and interventions have been doing more harm or have even harmed, then we should be held accountable. What are the codes of accountability that we have to comply with? We don't. We just exonerate it as well.
Yes.
Yes, hello. So I would like to go back to the beginning of the discussion. It was interesting how the whole beginning was about how to be included or recognized as human in the Western world. So based on all what you said at the beginning in your discussion, we could have almost understand that your answer was human rights are Western value and how to be recognized by them. By focusing on access to Western society as a way to access human rights, aren't we saying that indeed they are not universal? Yet, we started saying that in the movie we are not necessarily listening to the victim voice, particularly voiceless Westerns. So the example of the DRC, Bangui, etc. So I would like to go back to the movie, to the Syrian girl, for example, and share that I believe human rights, mainly the core human rights, were also built for her and other victims that we did not hear at first, and that we are not still really discussing here. Are we saying that human rights should be also for them, but that it will never work because they won't be enforced? And we need another way for the victim of human rights violation to access justice and rights? And if human rights is not the solution, then what should that be? You mentioned taking into account context, identity, and specific context. What would that mean regarding human rights?
Your question has multiple parts. I think the last being, again, just to go back, I don't think anybody is saying that you do away with human rights. That I think what folks are saying is that there is an imperfect system and that it is based on a lot of the reason why one focuses on Western rights is because the full access or full realization of those rights also almost always in this world comes with association with Western statehood. I think that's the thing, is like if you are a citizen of one of these countries, that you're more likely to have those rights actualized than if you're not. And that's a big problem. And I think it does also then shift any discussion in that direction, which is not to say that you can't have this discussion outside of the context within this particular place when you're talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and rights regime that is enforced, or that is often said to be enforced by Western powers, in many of the ways that you're talking about, maybe not even in the service of actual delivery of those rights, but for other things like security concerns, et cetera, et cetera. That's where the discussion has to go in a lot of ways, because it is at that point that you will, in fact, I think, affect the most change. I think when it comes to the young woman in the video and her story, and the realization that she may never get justice, I think that's really tragic. And I think that's, again, why we all watch all of these things. Because in a space, at least, and this is what I tell myself, and it might not be the right thing, but in a space where you cannot necessarily have direct impact, and I think this is where this film does a good job, the ability to know or the ability to be aware is a good starting point. That I think it's often people will lull themselves into saying, oh, well, at least I know, therefore I'm not bad. But I do think there is something to be said for the discomfort that a film like that causes, because it does make you understand, or it hopefully makes you take the leap to like, I am somehow complicit in all of this, and I am somehow somebody who has allowed for this to happen, both indirectly, just by not caring, and also directly by supporting, at various points in time, we're supporting countries or governments that allow or actively support people who do this.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. So in reference to the discussion about who is defined as familiar and how that is a construct and constructs can be changed if we're willing to change them in response to that specific discussion, it seems like we're facing a twofold problem. So basically, what are some of the ways we can go about changing this structure when so many people already have a very difficult time coming to understand the problems as structural? So basically the two simultaneous goals that I'm thinking of are, ideally we'd want to go about addressing the structural causes of the problem while also addressing the consequences. So how do we balance this twofold goal?
I kind of feel the answer's in your question, that you have to balance those two, right? You have to bring what you call norms, dominant norms, that people are assimilating to into the conversation of human rights, not just about the direct physical violation, right? And you have to bring the structural and material context into the conversation as well. So it's not about balancing, it's about making sure they are part of a human rights conversation. So that, like I said, one of the things that at least the first two segments of the film do is say that make one think that the turn to zero impunity means that we're focused mostly on prosecuting the individual perpetrator. And that, of course, then draws attention away from structures and from state and from norms of behavior. And it also produces this common sense narrative about sexual violence. Rape is the worst thing that can ever happen to you. The woman is a victim. And that the best solution to this is a criminal law response where the individual perpetrator needs to be put behind bars. But that doesn't solve the problem, right? So you've actually, the very fact that you mentioned all of that means that, well, you're already aware that needs to be part of the conversation, right? It cannot just be limited to this kind of approach, law enforcement.
I think that there are also some concrete examples of people who have managed to influence structural change. I mean, I think if you look at the civil rights movement in the United States, I think that's a very strong example. I mean, it's, again, like, the gains are not perfect, but if you look at, there was a huge structural shift in society, and I think people are advocating for even more of a structural shift. I think what you see now in terms of the things that come up where, you're talking about things like redlining, you're talking about things like mass incarceration, and people drawing those links. Again, it's really trying to shift the conversation away from this lull that we had, which was, oh, okay, now it's not structural anymore. Black people, white people can eat at the same lunch counter. I think there are people who are dedicated to bring it back to societies themselves can organize to eliminate or exclude people, and we need to always be aware of that. So look out for things like Black Lives Matter. Look out for things like the women's marches that are happening. Look out for a lot of the LGBTQ movements that are really focused on some of these, on working on structures and systems and transforming the way that they operate. I think, just to add to that, I think it's an interesting thing now that the United States military, as a super conservative structure, is advocating or on the side of more transgender rights than the rest of society. That will tell you something about structural change.
That's a bit scary.
I know it's scary, but
we have only a few minutes, so I'll ask in a minute for a few last words you'd like to share with the audience. But it interests me that we talk about tools and we talk about structure, and the way my mind works is sometimes I like to compare problems to my training, which is in medicine. And I think about it, we can't say an either or. The tools fail occasionally, and any treatment in the world will heal some people better than others. And we need to use it. And the way I think about the multiple layers is think of a lung cancer. If I had a patient who had a lung cancer, I will want, if that's feasible, to operate on them. That's the measure of the here and now. It just might save their life. It might be able to augment the fundamental thing that is going to affect them now. And this is, in my mind, similar to the small part, yet possible use of the tools that exist, whether this is a criminal justice tools or other justice tools. It doesn't eliminate that before people have that cancer or after it, the need to stop smoking is still there. You need to adjust the structural issues that might cause or are causing the symptoms that we are having. One without the other doesn't work. Without this surgery, in my mind, people can smoke or not smoke, they're likely to be dead when that happens, and vice versa. I struggle to criticize tools that exist because they work sometimes, and I feel I am unable to put myself in the shoes of someone who believes that it might bring them justice, and it does sometimes. I am no place to make that judgment. And I feel that our collective obligation, and to reiterate what Oza said, is trying to understand. I resent the fact that I am told I could never understand anyone else's plight. That is untrue. We have shared stories over human history into trying to understand, sympathize, and empathize with others. And that what creates society. The difference is our society isn't anymore 100 people who are exactly like us, which we grew up with. Our society is a much bigger one, makes it a harder job. But we have an obligation to empathize in a way for any of this to work. I feel I'm preaching to the choir because someone who comes on a Sunday night to watch a movie about sexual violence already wants and is a few steps towards empathizing. But this is probably one of the reasons to be optimistic, that we have that possibility, that we can move towards it at least. I will ask my lovely guests to give their 1 minute last thoughts, if I may.
Do you want to go? I mean, I think in terms of last thoughts, it's to reiterate some of what you said, which is that I think one of the best, or one of the tools that we have towards breaking some of the systems is allowing for multiple narratives, and for giving ourselves the space to access these multiple narratives and sit with these multiple narratives no matter how uncomfortable they make us. I think when you do that, you then get into this idea of how you change systems. And ultimately, I think what we're all looking for is how do you change systems to better each individual's life? And I think it's clear that the current system is very imperfect and doesn't necessarily always work in support of that. But I do think that it's a starting point, and I do think that the more perspectives we have on it and the more ability we have to challenge ourselves when it comes to things that we've just accepted as universal or normal or whatever, I think the better a system we will be able to create in the future.
Thank you.
I mean, I guess I would say that we cannot not want human rights, even though they cannot give us what we want. And I think that's important to understand because it immediately tells that human rights are in fact political constructions. They're not just ideals. Everybody can use human rights. All players have used, all sides of the debate have used human rights to advance particular agendas, whether they're of civilizing missions or racial superiority, or of trying to ensure that there's a recognition of humanity of groups of people who have never been recognized as humans in the first place. So it's used by all sorts of players. And as long as if we begin to understand that, we won't get disillusioned. We'll continue to do the work of human rights, but we'll do it with a different orientation. And I think that's very important at this moment of time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attendance and talk.
T'as pris plein de questions, trop bien.